Welcome, beloved ones, on another forming edge of another week. We gather ourselves into community once again. In this time of together, yet still physically apart, let us look at one another's faces across the internet, assure ourselves that we are still here, and remember those who are not with us today and those who are no longer among us. Let us remember that with each breath we take in, out, we are sharing in the gift of life. For each of us and for all on this earth, the sun waltzed across the threshold of our horizon in its daily routine this morning. Whether or not it will bring simply light or dance its shining rays into our being changes from place to place. Where I am this morning, it is simply light. With our joys and our sorrows, let us open our hearts and minds to dance with the spirit of life and love. With a simple waltz by Estelle D. Ricketts, written in the 1890s, Olga ushers us into worship. We hear this morning the first written solo piano piece by an African American woman, that is, first written that we know of at this time. May we notice our breath and look at one another's beautiful faces as we listen. Thank you, Olga. That was so lovely. May our spirits waltz into our chalice lighting. Our chalice, as many of us know, but in case some among us have not been with us before, is a symbol of the Unitarian Universalist faith tradition. And it has many different interpretations, including the light of reason, the warmth of community, and the flame of hope. And this morning, Pete Mirswa will light our chalice. And if you have one at home, please take this moment to light yours as well. as I will also light mine. And Pete will lead us in our chalice lighting with these words.
This morning's chalice lighting words are by Reverend Abigail. A light with which to see into the fullness of our own being within us. A light with which to see into the fullness of all those around us, among us, between us, and beyond us. A light to spark the flame of curiosity about the shadows, and a light to illuminate our yes to life's call. And may the light of our yes radiate into the vastness of living, past, present, and future.
What a beautiful chalice, and thank you, Pete. In our non-creedal faith tradition, we have, instead of a creed, aspirational principles that we look to illuminate, often through our variety and breadth of chalice lightings. Each congregation covenants to affirm and promote 7 principles. There is an 8th proposed one. Within our communities, we affirm and promote. Among our relations with all the other Unitarian Universalist congregations, we affirm and promote. And beyond our tradition, as we relate with the wider world and community in which we live and breathe. The first principle is that we covenant to affirm and promote as a congregation the inherent worth and dignity of every person. These words mirror a spiritual truth set forth in virtually all religious traditions. Most of us are familiar with it as the Great Commandment, as it is known in Judaism and Christianity. From the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18, or the book of Mark, chapter 12, verse 31. Love your neighbor as yourself. The golden rule was how it was taught to me. How did you learn it? I suspect that virtually every one of us has had at least one life experience where our own inherent worth and dignity was not affirmed. Most of us have probably had a multitude. We know that oppression, in its very direct and indirect forms, erodes our spirits, our souls, our sense of meaning, purpose, and agency in living. It can kill our yes to life within. The hymn we're about to sing, How Could Anyone Ever Tell You, written in 1988 by American Libby Roderick. Somewhere I read that she wrote it for a friend who was in the midst of a difficult struggle. With its simple single verse, which will be on the screen in a moment so we can muted sing along, it addresses what happens when we experience some aspect of oppression. How could anyone ever tell you you are anything less than beautiful? It goes. How could anyone ever tell you you are less than whole? It is in some measure almost an anthem of our first principle and the golden rule. And like the old story about putting on your own oxygen mask first in an airplane emergency before you help another with theirs, we must have enough loving for ourselves. We must value our own inherent worth and dignity before we can authentically honor the inherent worth and dignity of another. Olga will lead us in this song.
How could anyone that your loving is a miracle. How deeply you connected to my soul. How could anyone ever tell you are anything less than beautiful? How could anyone ever tell you're less than a mole? How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you connected to my soul.
The story of Echo and Narcissus. When Zeus came to the mountains, the wood nymphs rushed to embrace the jovial god. Played with him in icy waterfalls and laughed with him in lush green glades. Zeus's wife Hera was very jealous, and often she searched the mountainside, trying to catch her husband with the nymphs. But whenever Hera came close to finding Zeus, a charming nymph named Echo stepped across her path. Echo chatted with Hera in a lively fashion and did whatever she could to stall the goddess until Zeus and the other nymphs had escaped. Eventually, Hera discovered that Echo had been tricking her, and she flew into a rage. "Your tongue has made a fool of me," she shouted at Echo. "Henceforth, your voice will be made more brief, my dear. You will always have the last word, but never the first." From that day on, poor Echo could only repeat the last words of what others said. One day, Echo spied a golden-haired youth hunting deer in the woods. The boy's name was Narcissus, and he was the most beautiful young man in the forest. All who looked upon Narcissus fell in love with him immediately. But he would have nothing to do with anyone, for he was very conceited. When Echo first laid eyes upon Narcissus, her heart burned like the flame of a torch. She secretly followed him through the woods, loving him more with each step. She got closer and closer until finally Narcissus heard the leaves rustling. He whirled around and cried out, "Who's there?" From behind a tree, Echo repeated his last word, "Here." Narcissus looked about in wonder. "Who are you? Come to me," he said. Narcissus searched the woods, but could not find the nymph. "Stop hiding! Let us meet," he shouted. "Let us meet," Echo cried. Then she stepped from behind the tree and rushed to embrace Narcissus. But the youth panicked when the nymph flung her arms around his neck. He pushed her away and shouted, "Leave me alone. I'd rather die than let you love me." "Love me," was all poor Echo could say as she watched Narcissus run from her through the woods. "Love me, love me, love me." Humiliated and filled with sorrow, Echo wandered the mountains until she found a lonely cave to live in. Meanwhile, Narcissus hunted in the woods, tending only to himself, until one day he discovered a hidden pool of water. The pool had a silvery smooth surface. No shepherds ever disturbed its waters, no goats or cattle, no birds or fallen leaves. Only the sun danced upon the still pond. Tired from hunting and eager to quench his thirst, Narcissus lay on his stomach and leaned over the water. But when he looked at the glassy surface, he saw someone staring back at him. Narcissus was spellbound. Gazing up at him from the pool were eyes like twin stars, framed by hair as golden as Apollo's and cheeks as smooth as ivory. But when he leaned down and tried to kiss the perfect lips, he kissed only spring water. When he reached out and tried to embrace this vision of beauty, he found no one there. What love could be more cruel than this, he cried. When my lips kiss the beloved, they touch only water. When I reach for my beloved, I hold only water. Narcissus began to weep. When he wiped away his tears, the person in the water also wiped away tears. Oh no, sobbed Narcissus. I see the truth now. It is myself I weep for. I yearn for my own reflection. As Narcissus cried harder, the tears broke the glassy surface of the pool and caused his reflection to disappear. Come back! Where did you go? I love you so much. At least stay and let me look at you. Day after day, Narcissus stared at the water. In love with his own reflection, he began to waste away from grief, until one sad morning he felt himself dying. Goodbye, my love, he shouted to his reflection. Goodbye, my love, Echo cried to Narcissus from her cave deep in the woods. Then Narcissus took his last breath. After he died, the water nymphs and wood nymphs searched for his body, but all they found was a magnificently beautiful flower beside the hidden pool where the youth had once yearned for his own reflection. The flower had white petals and a yellow center, and from that time on, it was called Narcissus. And alas, poor Echo, desolate after Narcissus's death, did not eat or sleep. As she lay forlornly in her cave, all her beauty faded away, and she became very thin until her voice was all that was left. Thereafter, the lonely voice of Echo was heard in the mountains, repeating the last words anyone said.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for stepping up and doing that for us this week. I think it would be fair to say that the insult narcissist has been front and center of our socio-political culture for the last 4 years. It may be currently a more insulting a word than several identified four-letter curse words, especially to those among us, myself included, who pride ourselves on being liberal, being community focused and caring, and think of ourselves as awaking, perhaps rather than woke. And yet, part of our developmental task as human beings, as spiritual beings, is to fall in love with ourselves. When I say love with ourselves, I don't mean infatuated or obsessed, as Narcissus was with his in this archetypal morality tale. And falling in love with ourselves is not only about our physical selves, though there is growing evidence that I've read, and many of you may have as well, that having some level of positive feedback about our physical being is one part of the developmental task of learning to love ourselves. We learn to love ourselves when, according to the child psychiatrist Winnicott, We've had a good enough mother. That's his phrase. And I'll leave mother open to many genders, but his phrase was good enough mother. We can see enough good enough selves reflected back from some adult caretaker in our infancy. Then we can grow into good enough mature people. As we grow, we often hear mirrored back to us by the adults or friends or teachers or the world around us some idea or phrase, something we performed that is received praise, that we are proud of ourselves for accomplishing. And this is good. We need that. We know, of course, too, that some of us as children and as parents weren't always able to be even good enough. Heard too many messages that made the words of our opening hymn so necessary for us to learn. Sometimes hearing or seeing ourselves in feedbacks from other influential people in our lives was significant enough to help us grow, even when there wasn't good enough parenting, good enough love, so that we could develop a good enough love for ourselves, so we could mature and deepen our relationship with ourselves, which leads us to deepen relationships with others, which leads to a deepening relationship with the gift of life and living into it. Of course, that's a huge simplification, and we humans are always more complicated and more complex than that. But love for ourselves is appropriate developmental work in growing up. And most of us, we hope, don't get stuck in that place because we are not receiving any feedback that's helpful. But Narcissus did. Narcissus got stuck in falling in love with his own reflection as the only place where he could feel anything. And yet, we all need to see our reflection in the world around us, which is why identity groups are so important, even as they also separate us. We are not told in the Great Commandment to love our reflections. We are told instead to love ourselves. And I don't know about yourself, but myself is, as the worship team is fond of saying in Pobuddy's Nerfict, myself is often frail and full of failure and mistakes. So we learn to love ourselves as imperfect human beings. So I wonder if we could, as the imperfect human beings we are, who are learning to grow through finding love for ourselves, imagine this story just a little bit differently. Just a short retelling of the story. So Zeus' wife Hera continues to be jealous, and Zeus continues to play around with the wood nymphs. Many of us know that story, right? And And Echo has long been recruited to kind of keep everybody away from Zeus and to keep Hera away. But one day, Hera confronts Echo, and Echo says to her, "You know what? You're right. That's what I do. I keep you away until he's done so you don't get hurt and he doesn't get found out." Isn't that a kind of love for herself that many of us seek and work our entire lives to learn and live into? A way to begin to tell the truths that are often so difficult for us to see and recognize our own part in, because they're not always flattering. And then just imagine Echo lays eyes on Narcissus. She falls in love, because falling in love is not something any of us have any control over, which is why it's falling in love. And we often kind of lose our own reason in those moments. And she follows him through the woods, and she sees him, and when he says, "Who are you?" and she comes out and he's not very welcoming, she says, "Ooh, why don't you just go off by yourself?" and goes away. Just another possible way for us to think about how Echo could respond. And then let's just imagine this scenario. Narcissus sees himself in the pool. He falls in love. And then he cries. And he realizes that he's fallen in love with himself. And instead of denying life and turning his back on the gift of life that he was given, he says, "Oh, I kind of like this feeling of being in love. Maybe I need to go find it not here in this reflection of myself, but out there in the wider world." Of course, when he does that, he will have to learn all sorts of new skills, including reflecting upon his own self and his own behavior and his own being in ways he's never done before. Not in the way of looking into a mirror and having it show you only yourself that you want to see, the beauty, the things that you like about yourself, but looking instead at some of the things we don't like and finding a way to come to terms with them. Rick Marston was a unique Unitarian Universalist minister, according to one of my colleagues, Kirk Lodeman Copeman, in a 2008 blog he wrote. At a time when in our tradition, all our ministers were parish ministers, or all those we acknowledged were parish ministers. He was ordained solely as a bard. He wrote and sang his songs, traveling around our country, visiting our congregations, sharing his gift. According to Lodeman Copeman, this song, "Let It Be a Dance We Do," was written for a friend of his daughter's, a young dancer who was in a tragic car accident that badly crushed some part of her leg or legs. The song, which he wrote not long after the accident while she was still in the very initial stages of healing, was an invitation to her to heal, to hope, and to reclaim her identity, to reclaim her self-love, though there was no guarantee at that point she would ever even be able to walk. Lodeman Copeman goes on to say that she did learn to walk again, though perhaps not dance. If we're not going to allow ourselves to die when we begin to look at the reflection that's less than perfect of ourselves, if we're going to answer yes to life when life takes away the very thing that we think defines us, that is a part of our identity, when we go through those dark nights of our soul, when we've lost something valuable, how do we still love ourselves? Perhaps we have to learn how to dance. As Ecclesiastes 3 says, to everything there is a season, and one of those seasons is a time to mourn and a time to dance. Please feel free as we listen to this anthem, and as you are able, to dance in your chair, dance in your heart, dance on your feet, dance on your hands, however you may dance. Let it be a dance.
Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Let the dancing song be heard. Play the music, say the words, and fill the sky with sailing birds. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Learn to follow, learn to lead. Feel the rhythm, feel the need to reap the harvest, plant the seed. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Everybody turn and spin. Let your body learn to bend, and like a willow with the wind. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. A child is born, the old must die. A time for joy, a time to cry. Take it as it passes by. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Morning star comes out at night. Without the dark there is no light. If nothing wrong, then nothing's right. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let the sunshine, let it rain. Share the laughter, share the pain. And round we go again. Let it be a dance.
Thank you, Olga. That was just lovely. Hold all these joys, sorrows, and concerns in our hearts. Singing together, draw the circle wide. let us enter together into the spirit of prayer and reflection. Spirit of life and love, hand of compassion, growing heart and mind, source of mystery, who out of nothing brought everything that is. Out of what we are, bring more of what we dream but have not dared. Direct our power and passion to creating life where there is death, to putting flesh of action on bare-boned intentions, to lighting fires against the midnight of indifference, to throwing bridges of care across canyons of loneliness, so that we look on creation together and call it very good. And may the good we see embolden us into more love for living within, among, between, and beyond. The words of Ted Loder adapted a bit. This morning and throughout the month of February, as much as possible, Olga will be highlighting the music of African American composers, especially perhaps women composers who so often get overlooked and left out. Let us continue on into our own silence and prayer reflection as we listen with this memorial piece by Dr. Valerie Caper, who has a long list of recordings, compositions, and performances alongside her distinguished university level music educator career. Dr. Capers was the first blind person to receive both a bachelor's and a master's degree from the Juilliard School. She continues to live in the New York area, and this short piece is Billy's song for Billie Holiday, dedicated in fondest memory to the great lady of song. Thank you. Thank you. That was lovely. This past week, I began reading Robin DiAngelo's book, White, fragility. You may have read that as a congregation or individually, but it got me to thinking a bit about the beloved hymn we began with today. How could anyone ever tell you you are anything less than beautiful? And that hymn was important to me at a point in my life where I was struggling to find my own value and worth, to reflect on my meaning and purpose. So I know that it is important, and we are all in different places in our own journey as it comes to learning to love ourselves. And once again, that is good. That is one of the beauties of Unitarian Universalism, that we may be on our journeys within this tradition where we are. But I think there is another truth, and I'm going to speak now. When I say us, and when I am speaking to this, I speak primarily as a white person. I have lots of other identities, but right now it is my race and whiteness that I want to identify. We have often used that hymn or our first principle to get stuck in an individualism that is not unlike Narcissus looking at his own reflection with admiration. Getting stuck in our individualness and stayed in a place where we've not been able to look beyond, to see the ways in which our inherent worth and dignity might not be challenged as much as we imagine it to be. If we look more deeply at the fault lines and failures and mistakes that have come with the legacy and with the current living of being white in this culture. In her book, if you haven't read it, I don't think this is a spoiler, D'Angelo identifies two pieces of cultural thinking that get in the way of our ability to look more deeply at the structural racism that exists within us and around us. One of those is individuality. And excuse me for a moment as Po Buddy's nerfed here. It is cold outside. Individuality, the idea D'Angelo puts forth that as an individual, we have complete and total control over ourselves, gets in the way of looking beyond ourselves. It keeps us a bit like Narcissus, just looking at our own self and not knowing the extent to which we have caused another's pain. To move beyond that is to say yes to a deeper kind of life, a relational life that indeed honors the inherent worth and dignity of all and not just of ourselves. The yes requires us to let go of some of our cherished ideas about individualism that even when our mind tells us they're not great ideas anymore, we are often still caught in our bodies, in our lifelong learning, in the myths that we know about being a democratic nation and its ideals that stop us from going any further in reflecting on the ways in which our individualism isn't always true for everyone. Narcissus can't tell that he's only looking at himself for the longest time, or that if he looked around himself, he might find others who offer a way for him to become more beautiful and differently beautiful. Can we learn to look in the mirror with questions of self-reflection that help us look beyond ourselves? Can we begin to see ourselves by looking in someone else's mirror? What questions would we need to ask ourselves? And what discomforts might we be willing to learn to live with? There is a proposal among Unitarian Universalists for an eighth principle, and perhaps you are aware of this, but I'm just going to read it and let you know what it is. But it is a principle that invites us to say yes to a wider and larger way of living beyond our individualism that honors our own inherent worth and dignity, continues to invite us to love ourselves, because without that we can love no one else, but also invites us to move away from it in service of a larger yes. We, it begins, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. The proposed eighth principle of Unitarian Universalism. Our closing hymn was written by a Unitarian Universalist lyricist, Alicia Carpenter. There is no story given for this hymn that I've found, but it appears to me as an affirmation for the gift of life, an affirmation of our covenantal and spiritual commitment as non-creedal and sometimes non-theological religious people of faith, to live this one wild and precious life, thank you, Mary Oliver, with a deep gratitude that embraces more than just learning to love ourselves, but invites us into the larger and more difficult task of learning to honor everyone's inherent worth and dignity and build that into the systems of our faith, of our world, and of our individualism, just as long as we have breath.
Just as long as I have breath, I must enter yes to life. Though with pain I make my way, still with hope I meet each day. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to life. Just as long as vision lasts, I must answer yes to truth. In my dream and in my dark, always that elusive spark. If they ask what I did well, tell them I said yes to truth. Just as long as my heart beats, I must answer yes to love. Disappointment pierced me through, still I kept my loving you. If they ask what I did best, tell them I said yes to love.
Let us go forth once again with these words from Anne Hillman. We look with uncertainty beyond the old choices for clear-cut answers to a softer, more permeable aliveness, which is every moment at the brink of death. For something new is being born in us if we but let it. We stand at a new doorway, daring to be human creatures vulnerable to the beauty of existence, learning to love.